Good morning. Kirk, I am so excited to speak with you this morning about the book. It's a fascinating story. You've written it so well, and I devoured the book. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I've got a million questions I want to ask you, and hopefully we'll save a little bit of time here for audience Q&A as well. A couple quick reviews of it. A literary police sketch, which is exactly how I felt, and it's so cinematically in feel. So maybe we'll round back to see if there's any news on book to film progress. But so back in August of 2011, you're out fly fishing with Spencer, your friend and fly fishing guide, who tells you about the story. And I think at that time there had just been a sentencing of Edwin. So you're immediately drawn in. You're already a writer, and so you feel connected to this story in some way. Did you have any sense of the scale of what you're about to take on and becoming basically an investigative reporter and private detective and flying around the world to solve the crime?
The one clarification is that I discovered the story. Can you all hear me? No. It doesn't sound like it's on. Do I need to switch this? It says on, people.
Maybe we'll just go cheek to cheek here.
How about that? Is that better? Okay. I was living in northern New Mexico in Taos at a writer's residency for several months, and I was supposed to be working on my first book. So I hadn't written a book at all. I hadn't even written a proposal for a book. I didn't have a book deal for my first book, and I had an agent who I describe as a narcoleptic. I would send him stuff, and the only way I could ever get a response is if I just kept clapping and saying, hello, and I was really kind of in a dark place and not thinking of myself as a writer and feeling like that world was kind of keeping me out. And so I had pretty intense block in terms of working on the book my memoir about what I've been doing before. And that's what kind of just propelled me out onto the river to frankly escape my troubles. Mm-hmm. And there was something so strange about what he said to me that it was a young American flautist who climbed the wall behind the British Museum of Natural History, used a diamond blade glass cutter and broke into the museum, shoved his wheeling suitcase through the window and filled it with the $1 million worth of exotic birds so that he could pluck the feathers and sell them to this cultish community of Victorian salmon fly tyers who are obsessed with these rare feathers. And that he was just sentenced, but because of some kind of astonishing quirks and twists and turns, he never went to prison, and half the birds were still missing. And when my guide kind of finished that sentence, I was like, well, there's a perfectly formed book. Why don't I try this? But I was not an investigative reporter. I didn't think of myself as that. It was just such a shiny, glimmering first part of the story that it very quickly just became an obsession for me that I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew there was something kind of beating at the heart of it that I had to keep chasing, Oh,
that's great. The Nicole Brown Simpson case has not yet been figured out either. Maybe you can take that on as your next project and put a proposal together.
Well, since the book has come out now, I think I'm at 6 museum heists that I think have now been other museum heists that have been carried out in the service of fly tyers. And people keep sending me new tips, and they're like, why don't you do this for your next book? And my wife is like, so you're just like, this is your thing now?
This is your jam.
Yeah, you're just going to go around chasing dead birds that got stolen from a museum. So I'm trying to kind of wall it off and do something new. So maybe that, I don't know.
When you wrote the book, you made the interesting and great decision not to start out contemporary with the crime and your investigations of it, but to take us back in time to Darwin and Wallace and how the museums acquired the birds in the first place. Why was it important to you to bring the reader back to the beginning there?
Well, that legacy, the background of these collections is the reason why this was not just in the end a magazine piece. Because at first I thought, okay, maybe I can, if I'm lucky, I could get like a New Yorker piece out of this or something. But then I discovered, and I didn't know anything about birds. I didn't know anything about museums. I didn't know anything about. I thought when you go to a natural history museum and you see the birds with the outstretched wings in the glass cases, that was it. That was their collection. I didn't realize that behind the scenes there were millions of specimens in drawers, and the birds that are kept for research, their wings are drawn tight to their body, their legs are drawn tight, and so that they can be stored in drawers for hundreds of years. And every new generation of scientists has approached these same specimens with new questions, with new tools. These birds were collected, some of them before the word scientist was even coined, before we understood the concept of genetic inheritance or even understood what DNA was. The things that scientists can do now, that Alfred Russel Wallace, who collected some of the birds that were stolen in this heist, a scientist now can pluck a single feather and reconstruct the entire food web from that bird's ecosystem from 200 years ago, just by looking at the isotope accumulations in that feather. And they can see whether or not it had a shrimp-heavy diet, and if there was less shrimp, then what was the source or the reason for that. I'm going to stop there, otherwise I'm going to start screwing up the science. So what I didn't want to have happen is that this just is like a quirky thing where a kid steals some birds and gets away with it. I wanted the reader to understand that this was, in the words of the director of the museum, this was a catastrophic theft from humanity. That these birds hold answers to questions that scientists haven't even thought of yet. That we have no clue what kind of answers might be dislodged from them in 100 years' time. And that the extraordinary lengths that people went to gather these things, and the curators that have protected them, not just from, bugs and decay and things like that, but these birds were saved from Hitler's Luftwaffe. The museum was hit 30 times during the Blitz, and they were secreted out in this army of unmarked trucks to this rural museum where they rested until Edwin broke into it. I wanted that moment then when he starts emptying these drawers out into his suitcase to be a real gut punch to the reader, so that they understood just how significant a loss this was. To give one example, and then I'll shut up, but the flame bowerbird, which if any of you have ever seen some of the David Attenborough clips on this, but the flame bowerbird is this stunning crimson red bird that has its mating dance. It actually holds a wing up like a matador in a cape, and then it dilates its pupils alternatingly in like this hypnotic thing. There are only, in all of the world's museums and university and research institutions, there are only something like 25 of these birds for scientific study, and Edwin stole 17 of them, and they haven't been recovered. And you can't go back, and they're alive now in the wild, but the value of these things is that this is what that species was like in 1790 or 1890. And so that's really what made this into a much bigger and much more morally urgent story to me.
It was a very effective way to set up the book, because you developed these birds as a character in the book. So by the time we get to the crime, it feels less like a theft and more like a kidnapping. As the reader, like, oh my, I can't believe he did this. So you also spent some time talking about feathers and fashion, and ultimately into the salmon fly tying community. Can you spend just a moment taking us through some of your thoughts and observations about that piece of it?
Yeah. Well, do you all know about like the feather fever, with women wearing? I mentioned this yesterday, but after Marie Antoinette wedged a diamond-encrusted egret plume in her hair, it kicked off this global fashion trend, where it was like the Gucci bag of that era was how exotic and how expensive was the bird that you could wear on your hat, like stuffed and mounted in your hats. It became so kind of obscene that, this is obviously before automobiles, but women would have to kneel in their carriages to kind of accommodate their plumaged coiffures. and they had to ride with their heads out the windows of the wagons, and the market demand resulted in a kind of an industrialized slaughter of birds, and it was the largest direct extermination of wildlife in the history of the planet. Was for women's fashion. I'm not beating up on women here, because the men then at the same time had developed this kind of esoteric art form of these salmon flies. They would pluck feathers from their wives' hats and their wives' collections, and they would tie them in these ornate patterns and recipes, they're called. These are mostly British aristocrats. And they would give them these lofty names like Exordium and the Evangeline and the Green Highlander and all of these things, Jock Scott. And it was a single one of these flies would have, 10 or 20 species of birds. I mentioned this yesterday, but the relevant thing here is that salmon are colorblind when they're spawning. You don't have to have a PhD in biology to understand that a salmon in Scotland will not have an attraction to a feather from a bird of paradise from the highlands of New Guinea. They're never going to meet each other in the natural world. This is truly a human contrivance. Salmon, even when they're spawning, aren't even feeding at that point. They're striking out of aggression to protect their eggs. So you can catch salmon with dog fur tied to a hook. But over the last couple hundred years, it's a community of exclusively men. I've never found a woman that does this. I got really excited because I thought I found a woman fly tyer in one of these private Facebook groups, and she was posting all of these pictures of her flies, and it was her husband using her account because he didn't. But over the last 150 years, this art form has kind of morphed or mutated into this kind of cult-like. Well, just a cult, honestly. I mean, they have consecrated these 150-year-old texts that say you have to use one tail feather from the king bird of paradise. You have to use two feathers from the resplendent quetzal. You have to wrap this type of feather around the shank, and it's all meaningless. It doesn't. It has no connection to reality. But there's status in those who can tie the exact recipes. And that's really what drove Edwin, who was one of these master fly tyers, that's what drove him to do this whole thing.
So throughout the book, and you set this up very well in the beginning, throughout the book there's this tension between plucking a bit of nature for art or science versus leaving nature alone. And you set aside the mass extinction of bison and other species, which is really tragic. But as you say, for the scientists, they can test levels of mercury in the oceans over decades or centuries. Mm-hmm. Having connected with various stakeholders, and there's also this one line in there, Alfred Newton said way back to Wallace of collectors bringing some of the nature into the museums. He says of them stocking the museum, but they unstock the world, and that is a terrible consideration.
Yeah.
Having spoken to people on all sides of this, where do you come down on this debate?
I'm pretty squarely on the side of the museums and of these research institutions. That's a famous quote of Newton's that I felt belonged in the book, but there has no scientist and no naturalist has led to the extinction of a species. These collections are vast. The British Museum's collection of bird skins alone is 750,000 of them. They have something like another 300,000 or 400,000 eggs alone. They have 2.5 miles of bird skeletons and birds preserved in jars of spirit. But they were, especially nowadays, there are so many conventions and regulations governing the taking of a species for scientific research that there's no chance that it's going to lead to the decline or extinction of a species. And in many cases, these collections that they're maintaining are vital to policymakers being able to determine whether or not a species has gone into an endangered space. They're useful. Like, for example, the California Condor Revitalization Program is using specimens from the Natural History Museum that Edwin robbed to help them make determinations on the DNA. And they're able to compare 200-year-old DNA samples to the current ones to see how vital and healthy these birds are, essentially. So no, I mean, I think, the taking of an animal's life, obviously there's always an ethical consideration to be made, but the ones that are doing it from the vantage point of science, they're doing it, when they do it, knowledge is produced. When these guys do it, they're producing, frankly, and I say this as somebody who is a fly fisherman, they're producing a silly thing that's going to sit in a drawer and has no connection to the real world. And so I'm much more on the side of those that are probing these things for insights about who we are and how the world operates and where we're headed.
Okay. So we get into the crime itself and looking at what's motivating Edwin here. Clearly there's a financial motive. His family has fallen on hard times. He needs a very expensive flute. Along with that, though, he has an intense obsession with feathers and the fly tying. So after the arrest, as at the direction of the authorities, he's evaluated by, of all people, the cousin of Sacha Baron Cohen, who's an authority on
Borat,
Asperger's.
for all of those that
yeah. in main culture, Borat, and who renders a Asperger's diagnosis. Knowing the elements of the crime about as well as anyone, and having spent time in a room, maybe longer than the doctors, with Edwin, do you believe that there is some mental affliction there that warrants a mitigated sentence?
It's interesting. The reason why he was never incarcerated was not just that he had the diagnosis of Asperger's from this prominent Brit. It was that 10 years prior, and I promise you this is such a bizarre story that you're only getting the tip of the iceberg, but 10 years earlier, another kid with Asperger's had been a kind of chronic corpse robber. He kept breaking into a cemetery in Bristol and stealing skulls and vertebrae and making necklaces, and he was sent to prison, but it was he was released on appeal because it was determined that his diagnosis of Asperger's wasn't given sufficient weight in the sentencing process, and also that the British prisons weren't well enough suited to help someone like him. I had really become obsessed with every detail of the crime, but I didn't know Edwin personally, and so it was difficult for me to know what kind of weight to give to that. The courts gave it a huge amount of weight. The transcripts that I managed to pry from the Crown Court, the judge basically just said he had to throw up his hands because he knows that if he sentenced Edwin to prison, it's just going to be, he's going to be released on appeal. After 4 years of trying, I finally got Edwin to agree to an interview, and I flew to Dusseldorf, Germany, where he performs in symphonies and in chambers as a flautist. I brought my wife with me. We had just gotten married, and like 2 days before we got there, it occurred to me that I might be bringing her into like an unstable situation. And in my past life, I had been in Iraq during the war, and I was used to kind of unpredictable things. But I was like, my wife is here. What if he tries to like do something? And I thought even if there was like a 1 or 2% chance of something happening, I should try to mitigate it. So I went on Yelp, Dusseldorf, and typed in security guards. And I got a 6'4" bodyguard named Klaus, who showed up in a tracksuit to our hotel room. It honestly, I mean, it looked like he had like shaved his beard with a knife that morning. And he gave us a walkie-talkie. He looks around the room and he's like, "Okay, if anything happens, just squawk this. I'm going to go hide in the hallway now." And so I gave it to my wife, and I promise I'm going to get back to Asperger's. But I gave it to my wife, and the deal was that since I was going to be so focused on the interview, that she was going to hide the walkie-talkie under the cushion on the couch while she was working the audio recording equipment. And at the 6-hour marker of our interview, I said to Edwin, I was like, I don't want to sound insensitive. I have people in my extended family that have Asperger's. I'm not a clinician, but you don't seem like you have Asperger's to me. You're making sustained eye contact. You're reading the subtext of my questions. He was the most formidable interviewee in that he would see my line of attack 10 questions in advance and throw flack up and try to redirect. And if he was halfway through a sentence giving me an answer and my brow furrowed just the slightest bit, he would adapt on the fly. I mean, and I said to him, I was like, it doesn't seem like you have this. And he had been very, poised during the whole interview. And then he goes, well, and I'm paraphrasing here, the exact quotes are in the book. But he said, I kind of became what I needed to become in that moment. And he goes, I never had a problem with eye contact before, and I don't have a problem now. But all of a sudden, you read about the symptoms and eye contact, and he started going like this in front of me, and he goes, and another one of the symptoms is repetitive motion, and so he starts doing this, and he then starts mimicking Baron Cohen, asking him questions, and then his responses, and so to me it was like a fairly clear admission that he had faked it, and it is. I mean, I don't want to sound like I have an axe to grind. Like no one bullied me when in fact, with Asperger's or anything. If anything, if there's any generalization you can make, people with Asperger's have a heightened sense, a more acute sense of right and wrong. So the idea that someone with Asperger's would just be so adrift that they would do this horrendous thing of breaking into a museum is outrageous. But I looked over at my wife at that moment, like, can you believe what he just said? And she was fast asleep on the couch from jet lag. And the pillow had the cushion had slid over, and the walkie-talkie was in plain view, and her hand was right by it. So I was worried she was going to accidentally summon Klaus, and which made this whole new dynamic to the interview where I was kind of started talking really loudly on my next question, and but I did approach Baron Cohen. He was not really thrilled with my questions, but I asked him if it's possible that Asperger's could be faked. I asked him what kind of controls were put in place when you're in a criminal justice situation where your diagnosis would be the one thing that would keep someone from prison. Are there any controls against bias in the diagnosis process? And he told me, he's like, yes, it can be faked, but that you would hope that the expertise of the clinician would be able to smoke that out. And since this all happened, Asperger's does not exist as a standalone diagnosis anymore, in part because of the variability in which these diagnoses were being conferred. It's a subjective diagnosis. But I'm always very sensitive in talking about this because I don't. To me, it's such a. I think there's something very wrong that there was. I mean, in my take, there was no justice delivered here.
Mm-hmm.
This was a huge blow to the Natural History Museum, but just to the march of science and human knowledge. And he, after being arrested, after pleading guilt, never spent a night behind bars. He was then given his degree from the Royal Academy of Music. I mean, I had a friend in college who stole $100 worth of things in a misdemeanor, and he was kicked out of school. Edwin's theft, by some estimates, was millions of dollars. But I think the Brits were just so embarrassed by this that they just did whatever they could to push it out of the news and sweep it under the rug and get him out of the country, frankly. But I hope I haven't sounded insensitive to people with Asperger's, because was not my approach. It was really just, I think he gamed the system to stay out of prison.
Well, I'm no clinician myself, but in reading the book, I found him to be clever, socially very charming, adaptable, as you say, and unremorseful. So I was thinking he's a sociopath more than that. But why do you think that Edwin and Long sat down with you at all, knowing that was putting them potentially in real peril?
Well, so just for those who haven't read the book, but Long is a Norwegian fly tyer who's the same age as Edwin. His parents, he's Vietnamese. His parents were resettled to Norway after the fall of Saigon. And Long was kind of, depending on how you read the book, a witting or unwitting accomplice in this whole crime. My wife asks me that question all the time. She's like, "Why are these people talking to you? Like, there's nothing good that comes out of this." And I mentioned this yesterday, but she's a lawyer by training, and she at certain points during this marathon interview with the feather thief, I could feel her like leaning forward to be like, "Edwin, don't answer this question." Like this is, and I had to kind of like, just leave me, stay out of this. Like I'm getting them here, you know. But I honestly think part of this was if I had had a 1 year timer to write this book and to get this story, it never would have happened. Because I was doing this kind of as like a side hobby, and I mean, this investigation was 6+ years, but I didn't start writing the book until year 5. It wasn't a full-time thing, but because of that amount of time, I was able to, I literally had I had a large sheet of paper. I had Edwin's name written at the middle of it. And over the course of the years, I wrote down, there's maybe 200 names on this list, and it's a map of what I jokingly refer to as the Feather Underground. And if I would see a spat on one of these private forums between two fly tyers over whether or not it's 5 twists of tinsel or silk or 4, and then they get, nasty with each other, I would make a note on this kind of map saying that these two guys don't like each other, so that if I ever got one of them, if I was ever able to interview one of them and I mentioned the other one, then he might start talking dirt on the other one, and if I get the other one, then I might get, and over the course of years, because I had just gotten so many of them to start talking, I kept flipping one after another inwards closer and closer to Edwin. And so by the time, I think the reason why Edwin finally agreed to talk to me was that, I told him, I said, the book is happening, and here are the 70 people that I've talked to that you sold to, that helped you out with this, that were your mentors, that you went to school with. So I think it's only fair that you have a chance to tell me your version of the events, and I'll try to sort out, so that if I've got something really glaringly wrong, you can tell me. But it really was just kind of attrition and wearing them down, and that required time,
Well, that is incredible investigative work, and you're complimentary of the police force there, and I know you thanked the detective in the acknowledgments, and I know you also mentioned Jeff Cowan in the acknowledgments. I didn't see him here this morning. I think I saw him earlier. But there are times when I was reading the book when I felt reading through it that when you uncovered some information, the name of Goku, like the account buying, you seemed either a little surprised or a little frustrated that the police had not yet uncovered that as well. And you're like, do you feel that the police work around this was shoddy?
I think one of the things that I was disabused of very early on was I thought, okay, here's a big museum heist. Here's the local detective. This has all of the kind of classic elements of classic heist. There's a British female detective with bad teeth. I mean, it was when I met her, I was like, this is perfect. I say this with a lot of affection for the detective, but when I kind of swooped into the story, it was obviously after we knew who the thief was and the sentencing it had already occurred, but there were some of these things were glaringly obvious. I mean, he had a website, edwinrisk.com, where he was selling what are obvious museum specimens. They have cotton stuffed into their eyes instead of glass eyes, and he was using the Latin binomials, which are indexed by Google. And so that if the museum had just run a search for their missing species, they would have seen his website with a 1-to-1 match of what was missing. they had Edwin's name because they had given him access to the museum 8 months before the crime. That's how he staked it out and figured out which case he would go to and where his entry and exit point was. But the detective, when she very quickly said, it's not like I get one case at a time. Like, she had, I don't know how many. I mean, over the course of her investigation, I mean, it was 15 months. She's like, I can't even tell you how many domestic assaults, how many breaking and entering, how many other crimes come in. And so really what she told me was that it came down to what leads the museum could help her generate, and also what tips just came in through like the Crime Stoppers hotline. And the museum, I think, frankly, pretty tough on the museum. I've become friends with David Attenborough in the course of this, and I had this long lunch with him when I was over there, and he's a trustee of the museum, and he like slammed the table down, and he's like, "You were too soft on the British Museum. They completely dropped the ball on this thing." Brits don't say drop the ball, I guess, but whatever the Britishism is there. His if they had run a search in their inbox, they would have seen Edwin's name inquiring about the very birds that were stolen. And so this was I think in the end it was a situation where they just were so embarrassed by this, frankly, easily carried out heist that they wanted nothing to do with it. And in fact, the investigation, they never found out who did it. The only reason that Edwin was arrested was that one of his customers was showing off one of his birds at a fly tying festival in this small Dutch town. And the guy he was showing it off to was an undercover detective in the police service of Northern Ireland, who was not assigned to this case. He was just also happened to be a fly tyer because he would be on these 8 or 10 hour stakeouts during the Troubles, and that was the only way he could keep sane in his car, was just tying flies while he was watching for any kind of sign of life outside. And he knew about the museum heist, and so it kind of raised his eyebrow, and he's the one that called in the tip that led to Edwin's arrest. Anyways, that was a long answer, but I don't know if I got.
Well, it was what you did effectively was follow the money and the transactions, and it feels like both the museum and the police were slow. They were very focused on the scientific value of the birds, and very slow to pick up on the economic value of the birds. And even afterward, the museum is saying, well, once it's damaged a little bit, the scientific value is blown. Really, we don't even want it back. It's like, well, why don't you take it back, sell it for millions of dollars, and then buy better security?
Yeah, I went. There was a part of the book tour was through England, and the kind of British equivalent of Barnes and Noble, I forget the name of their Waterstones. They wanted to do some interview at the museum, and the British Museum made it very clear that I was not welcome on the premises. You will not, which it's kind of like, I mean, it's funny to me, but at the same time, I spent 5 years of my life trying to get their birds back to them. I was trying to help them solve the crime they didn't really care to solve. But so we had to do this guerrilla style filming outside of the museum where like they'd ask me one question and then the security guard would come out and we'd have to sneak around the back or whatever. And at one point we were in the alleyway that Edwin had sneaked up and entered the museum through, like scaling this wall. And I noticed now, speaking of security, that they now have a security camera up, except it's facing the wrong direction. It's not facing over the alleyway. And so this is really, but this is the larger issue here, though, is that these are public institutions, these are public trusts, and so as much as I kind of rag on the museum, they are the true victims here, and what they're doing is they can't exist as a fortress where they don't let anyone in. Their job is the dissemination of knowledge, and these things are not meant to be kept up in a place where no one can see them. And so they're only as secure as the funds are that are granted to them. Since the book has come out, a couple of things have happened. One is that I've done a number of events at natural history museums, and at almost every one, a curator takes me aside to show me where they were robbed and where. So I did the main launch was at the LA Natural History Museum, and their head of their bird collection brought me over to one case and showed me along the bottom these crowbar marks where someone had pried open and stolen the same species. So that they think it was a fly tie-in related theft. They also lost a three-toed sloth during one of the sleepover at the museums for adults, which is another thing. Like, museums are starting to do this less and less because adults go to museums, they get popped, and then they steal something. But the other thing that has happened is that almost all of these museums now have put locks on each of the species, on the cabinets housing each of the species mentioned in this book, which is a kind of crappy legacy that to walk away with, that there's a trail of locks following me. But I think they've become aware now of just how valuable this stuff is.
I have a small detail question about the crime that I was looking for in the book and didn't see but may have missed. Did they ever tie the blood from the crime scene back to Edwin?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So the initial, when they first found the broken glass, they didn't find anything. They weren't looking very closely, and so they just thought it was some breaking and entering and someone looking for a laptop, and they just closed the case that morning. When they eventually, a month and a half later, realized that they had been, this was a historic theft from them, the detective went back to the window that had been broken, and she found a little piece of a latex glove that had torn off. She found a drop of blood on a piece of glass, and she found the diamond blade glass cutter. They had missed all of this, but the DNA test, in the blood database, is only for obviously for people who have already given blood that's already on file. They have some criminal background, which Edwin didn't. But when he was arrested, they took a DNA sample, and it matched.
And it was a match.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Did you mention that in the book? I don't remember seeing that.
I think so, but
Okay.
if I didn't, that's a
So I'm like,
glaring
maybe it was
mistake.
long. Oh, we'll get the other guy now.
Yeah.
So the book has gotten huge acceptance, tons of buzz, and I'm curious, post-publication, now that it's sort of out there and getting so much attention, what is the reaction of some of the stakeholders? I just wanted to run through a few to the extent that you're aware of what the reaction is. What are the police, what has their reaction been to this in print?
Well, the British police have been very receptive. They've enjoyed the book. The British Museum are furious that the only thing that they have taken issue with is a line in the book where, and this is what Edwin told me, and I think he got this from his lawyers, but that the security guard didn't notice that the alarm was blinking, the indicator was blinking, because he was engrossed in a soccer match. And so it was this kind of otherworldly exchange with the British Museum where they were like, he doesn't even like soccer, and there wasn't a match going on that night. And then I had to find these obscure archives of broadcast archives to prove that yes, there was a match that night, and it was happening then. And but all of the actual criticisms directed against the museum, they haven't disputed any of that. But you won't find this book at the British Museum. You'll find it at every other museum, because really this is a love letter to natural history museums. What this book is at heart is a full-throated defense of their mission. And everywhere I've gone and done these events, when I'm at museums, there's a month later I get these really giddy emails from the administrators saying we have all kinds of new donors now, but the problem is they all want their donations tagged only to security cameras and things like. But to which I'm just just take it, whatever you can get. But no.
How about the fly tying community?
That's a sadder. There is a kind of tiny core of the community that I think still has their heads screwed on straight, and they've been trying to stigmatize the use of illegal and exotic feathers in favor of using what they call substitutes, but basically dyed feathers from game birds and things that they're not going to be wiped out. We're talking about dyed chicken feathers or turkey or pheasant feathers. But when you've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of your hobby to buy these rare feathers, that's a direct threat to your investment, to suddenly toss all of that and start using turkey feathers. So these guys are not making a lot of progress. The trade has moved deeper underground since the book has come out. They're using more coded language to sell this stuff on eBay and in these private forums. And the other thing I'm told is that most of the species have now quintupled in value since the book has come out, because they're aware of the risks of selling this, and so the market's kind of drying up and it's becoming more dear to these guys. But these things are always going to hold their value, and so I think a lot of them are kind of trying to wait out the storm and then return to normal. I hope not. But
Do you know of Edwin's reaction to the book?
Not really. We have not been in touch. I sent him a number of follow-ups after the interview about Long and some other things, but he never replied to those. There was This American Life did a radio version of the story, and according to the terms of my interview with Edwin, he wanted to have approval on whether or not the audio would be used for anything else. And so when they asked him, he's like, nope, I don't want anyone to hear that. So, but I don't really know.
Okay. Well, maybe one final quick one, and then we'll try to save a minute for a question or two from the audience. But to the extent that you're permitted to share an update with us, can you update us on any book to film? 'Cause it's just so, I've got to see this thing on a screen.
I'm not a superstitious person, but it's looking, we're like in very late stages now for the film adaptation.
Right.
And it's like directly with the studio, so I think it'll actually happen. But my lawyer wife says, like, all these things can always fall apart. Like, until we have the signed deal, let's not bank on anything. But it's such an intensely visual story. I mean, these birds, if you haven't looked at the Birds of Paradise on YouTube, just look them up on YouTube. Attenborough has a bunch of narrated clips. They are appropriately named. They don't seem like they could belong to this earth. And so there's something really kind of magical and captivating. And frankly, the flies themselves, these salmon flies, are extraordinarily beautiful things. And I mean, a single one can take 12 hours to tie. And so I tried to do justice to the beauty of them in the book, but I think it deserves to be told on screen too. I hope so.
Well, good luck.
Thank
I
you.
hope to see it. So we've got a little over 2 minutes left with our questions from the audience. And you ask it, we'll repeat it, and then, sir.
I'm interested in the correlation between fishing with those flies and just collecting them and storing them. I can't imagine anybody would throw that in the water and hope that it comes back out.
Yeah, so the question was, do people actually fish with these things? Like, how could you fish with such expensive things? I neglected to mention that the overwhelming majority of these guys have no idea how to fish. They don't. Seems like an important point now to mention. But some of these flies require so many rare feathers that they require something like $2,000 worth of feathers to tie one of them. For the most part, these guys tie these things and they put them away in a drawer in a dark room, and they periodically pull them out and just look at them with pride, or they show them off to the other members of the community, but that's it. Yeah. I think this is at heart, this is a story about human obsession with beauty and with status and with the kind of moral blind spots that can produce. I mean, what Edwin did was extraordinary and wrong, but and I don't want to put us all on that same spectrum, but all of us are chasing something that we want, and there might, I mean, my iPhone is, in it just itself, is a moral compromise. The price that I paid for it, and the way that it was created, the materials that are used and where they were mined to go into it, the kids that were probably used to assemble it, but I like my iPhone. And so I'm not trying to be the downer here, but this is not like such an isolated thing. This is a kind of bigger story about human obsession and destruction.
I have to confess that last night I had to close it. Once he got into the museum and out, I didn't go beyond because I wanted to be here this morning. But is it over? Is it over? I mean, can't someone reignite the search for all of these birds?
Just one note, we're just went out of time, so they're going to probably cut our mics here.
Well,
Are you going to be signing books?
Yes.
Okay.
She asked if it was over, couldn't somebody else find these birds? I think the reality is that now that the book is out, most of these guys have gone deep underground, and the other thing is that they only are identifiable by the tags tied to their feet. So even if the museum gets them back, if those tags are snipped off, they can't legally prove that they were theirs or know which one was which. And so all these guys, if I had Interpol descend on a home where all of them were, all the guy would have to do is just snip the tags off and burn them, and he'd be fine. And so there's a kind of depressing, I always just depress people in the end. I'm sorry. But,
Kirk, thanks very much.
Thank
Great
you.
job.
Thank you.